WarLegions. Hi everyone, this is Rick. I'm your host for today. Our previous host, Mr. Hollivan, has been missing in action, but he'll be back soon. Anyway, we have here
He's on tour, di ba?
Marco.
He's on
Ah,
tour of duty tayo. Tour of
yes,
duty
this
si
is the second coming of WarLegions, and we have here Dark Adam and Barca, and of course me, the social scientist, and Marco. So today we are going to talk about the crisis in Taiwan Strait. Am I right, guys?
Yep, 1995 to
yeah.
be exact.
Yes, right. So roughly a month ago, Secretary Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan amidst Chinese warning. And shortly after her visit, the Chinese Communist Party launched some war games across or near the island of Taiwan. And it signaled another conflict, or there's a conflict brewing in this region of the world. But actually, this originated decades ago. And to be more specific, we're going to talk about what happened in Taiwan in 1995. So that would be the starting point of our topic today. What happened in 1995 in Taiwan, and what is its implication to this region of the world in general, East Asia, or the Taiwan Strait? Okay, so Marco, can you give me some brief overview about what happened in 1995?
Basically what happened in 1985, it was a major crisis back then. As you know, Taiwan is regarded by China as a renegade province since the nationalists were defeated in 1949 after the Chinese Civil War. So for several decades, Taiwan was recognized, I think, until 1975, if I'm not mistaken, or late 70s. Taiwan had an official seat with the United Nations, but because of the warming up between the West and China back then, because they need China to counter the Soviet Union at that time. China, the People's Republic of China, became the newly recognized government for China, and they adhere to the policy of one China policy. So, but of course, the U.S. Maintained diplomatic relationships with Taiwan, but at a lower scale to prevent backlash from the mainland. Now, what happened even after that, warming up with mainland China? Tensions are still high between the two warring factions of China. So up to that point, Taiwan did not have elections. So by 1995, Taiwan was about to have its first presidential elections, and of course the Chinese saw this as a provocation that because they wanted Taiwan to be part of China. So it's a first step. The way that the Communist Party in China see it, the elections in Taiwan, it's like a first step of declaring independence, and that's what the mainland Chinese feared. So they part of the crisis when election preparations are ongoing in Taiwan. So the People's Liberation Army, or the Armed Forces of China, People's Republic of China, launched several exercises around Taiwan. So it was the biggest crisis back then since the end of the Cold War. So basically it created tensions, and for the U.S., fearing that there might be a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, they forced the Chinese to back down when they deployed the 7th Fleet, 2 aircraft carrier battle groups, and enter the Chinese Strait, and it forced China to back down. So
Yeah,
basically, that's
I
the
just have to
situation.
I just have to stop you from there because you mentioned a while ago that in the beginning of the 1970s, the United Nations began to recognize China, not Taiwan, as a
Yeah,
representative in the United Nations. So I'm gonna ask Barca for this. Like, why do you think? Why do you think the United States allowed China to gain a seat in the United Nations? Why do you think the United States was convinced that China, not Taiwan, should be the representative of the Chinese in the United Nations? Why did it happen? Did the United States feel afraid of the growing influence or power of communist China? Or were they threatened by Russia or the whole communist regime?
Oh, we will really never know exactly how they felt because there's some hot-blooded people, even way back then in the United States. Hot-blooded senators who were for prosecuting the PRC against in defense of Taiwan. But the thing there is, we have to also recognize that maybe the U.S. was playing the long game. That
I see.
in order to better keep track of China's or the mainland China's activities, by offering a seat at the table with the UN, they could better, uh, not really spy, but more like monitor their enemy,
Mm,
their potential enemy. Okay, so this being because this is already the third Strait crisis. Okay, Taiwanese Strait crisis. So in the first was around the 1950s, the first two. So it took almost a couple of decades just for this to reignite, and by pursuing this stance against mainland China and the Communist Party of specifically the Communist Party of China, because people are not bad. It's the government that are usually bad in this case.
speaking
So
of,
yeah,
right, yeah, I understand
that's
you in there. Yeah. So you're basically saying that the United States allowed China to gain a seat in the UN because they probably wanted to observe or spy on China, like they wanted to uh, try to measure the strength of communist China, if it's really capable of making an influence in the international arena. But I'm just curious about the so-called one China policy because Marco mentioned it a while ago. For Dark Adam, what do you think about one China policy? Do you think it's favorable to China, I mean communist China, or is it favorable to Taiwan?
Uh, you see, the conflict started, I think, when when people when China declared themselves as the original China, because the original China was supposed to be Taiwan, but since China is slowly gaining power, and then during the 1970s, they now become the new China. The Taiwan is no longer the China; it becomes the China province. So in 1995, when they declare Taiwan as an independent country, the legitimacy of China, the mainland China, as the original China, is threatened. You know,
Right,
so
that's true.
yes.
So if
So what they
okay, go
did,
ahead.
so, to make it short, to fix that problem, they created a one China policy, that the mainland China is the real China, and that Taiwan is, let's just say, it is China, but it's a province, but they're not allowed to declare as a country.
Okay.
But everybody knows that Taiwan is a country, but they should not declare themselves as a country. It's kind of like agree to disagree situation.
I see.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now, in my understanding, China in the beginning had a fear of invading Taiwan because of United States intervention. Marco mentioned that in 1995, the Seventh Fleet of the United States tried to organize a blockade around Taiwan to counter Chinese aggression. But what about now? I'd like to ask Marco on this. What about now? Do you think China would be willing to risk a war against Taiwan, given the fact that China now possesses the largest standing army in the world, and maybe soon it would have the largest naval force in the world? Do you think China would dare to do that?
Nag-zoom kami.
I think to answer that, of course, as of last year, China has become the largest navy in the world in terms of ships. Although by tonnage, they're still behind in terms of capabilities with the United States. But we have to understand that in 1995, the PLA were humiliated when the U.S. Navy deployed the two carrier battle groups, specifically the Nimitz battle group and the Independence carrier battle groups. The Chinese were aware that if a full-scale war would erupt, the PLA Navy would have a very short, exciting life. But fast forward, uh, the PLA, after remembering that situation, they decided to build up their armed forces. So basically, from the PLA, were able to, for the past 25 years, they are acquiring advanced weapons from China, from Russia. I mean, starting with Su-27 flanker jets and acquisition of Sovereignty class destroyers from Russia. Then they copied those designs basically and built up their navy. Now, to answer your question, Dark Scientist, regarding if China can now risk a more open conflict with the United States. Yes, the risk is much higher now that there will be an open conflict because first of all, the Chinese have certain military capabilities that could now match the United States or exceed the technological level of the United States. For example, the much taunted hypersonic missile technology. China generally is ahead in the U.S. in those certain categories, and the Chinese have roughly modernized majority of their air force and their navy. So at the start of the conflict, any conflict that would erupt today, 2022, the United States would be severely outnumbered. That's the reason why, if you look at the geopolitics now, the other regional powers like Japan, even Taiwan, they are now starting to modernize their armed forces because they know the naval dominance of the United States could no longer assure that they could win any open conflict. Sure, it will be it might drag you to an attrition conflict, but there's also a danger that dragging out the conflict would escalate into a nuclear exchange because China now has
Right.
a credible nuclear deterrence.
Yes. Yeah, I got your point, but I have to ask this question. This is to all of you guys, but I'll start with Marco. You mentioned that there's a big possibility that China, mainland China, would attack Taiwan, given the fact that China now possesses a much bigger navy than, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. But why invade Taiwan? Is there a strategic, geographic, or economic importance if China would invade or occupy Taiwan? What can China gain from invading Taiwan? I'd like Marco to answer that question at first.
Well, first of all, of course, political, that's already a given factor that they want to unite China. And second is economic, because Taiwan is a leader in semiconductors and it's also a major economic powerhouse. Now, geography yes, Taiwan is a very strategic island because uh, the U.S. has, the Chinese have divided the island chains surrounding their nation into three groups. Basically, the first island chain, which covers Japan, the Senkaku Islands, Taiwan, Philippines, and all the way down to Indonesia. That's what we call the first island chain. Now, if China was able to control Taiwan, it would allow their navy to have access to the Pacific Ocean. And of course, it's also in a matter of interest on part of the United States. They don't want to lose Taiwan, because by doing so, it would put in a strategic level, it would put their forces at an imbalance. You take Taiwan, it's easy for the Chinese to directly attack the main U.S. military base in Okinawa, and more importantly, they could now directly hit Guam.
Right.
So yeah, so that's the factors that you have to consider there.
Okay, so you're talking about the economic and the strategic importance of this first chain of islands, and Taiwan belongs to
Yes.
this first chain of island. Do you agree with this, Barca? In the strategic importance of Taiwan, Marco is basically saying that Taiwan is like an unsinkable aircraft carrier, like any other islands that China tried to occupy in South China Sea. That's very important for them militarily. Do you agree with that, Barca? Your mic is
Okay. Basically, he said it all, especially the part of reunification. So, consider it like this: China views Taiwan as like a little mole, or more more annoyingly, like a wart that needs to be removed on their face. So, for them, this disparity and uh, this bid for independence has gone on for too long. Even when economically, Taiwan is being sapped slowly by by mainland China. Okay, most of the electronics they can already copy. Okay, and a lot of the industries can even topple the industries of Taiwan. Okay, so there are cases where in the near future Taiwan might lose most of its enterprises to the mainland itself, or if there are other countries who are willing to give shelter or political asylum to the more patriotic Taiwanese, that could also go the other way.
But just a follow-up question. You mentioned about the Taiwanese industry being overpowered by China, but let's remember that Foxconn, which is the biggest factory, the biggest, shall we say, maker of electronics for many manufacturers such as Apple. Foxconn is a Taiwanese company, but it has its biggest factory in China. So basically, China has influenced the Chinese economy. I mean, Taiwan has influenced the Chinese economy through Foxconn, and at the same time, TSMC. Yeah.
Indirectly, yes. A lot of the companies that we know now, like Asus, Acer, they've already branched out to mainland China. Okay, for their manufacturing. Okay, even Samsung at one point was like that until they pulled out some of their leading factories and moved them somewhere else. I think Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, Taiwan did that, and I don't know if it was for altruism or for the sake of an optimistic unification. Okay, but the only thing that stood in the way of that such ideal unification is the Communist Party of China itself.
That's your belief. Do you agree with that, Dark Adam? Thank you for your opinion, Barca. Do you agree with that, Dark Adam? We have Foxconn, TSMC, Acer. These are giant Taiwanese companies, but most of their factories are in China. So, going back to my main question to Marco, what was my question again? What can China get if they
In occupied Taiwan.
Taiwan? That's the question, Dark Adam.
What they said are all correct. The problem of China is that they cannot copy or create the complexity of the microchip. You know, the 2 nanometer, was it?
Okay, but what about Huawei? Huawei is a growing industry, and it's.
Yes, it is. But the microchip of Huawei is not as powerful compared to the microchips in Taiwan. They buy those microchips. They don't make them there. You know, they can make microchips, but not the most expensive and not the most powerful microchips, because China just just let me explain here a bit. The problem of China is that they cannot really innovate. One of the reasons why they can't innovate is that just recently, I think 2017, China finally created a ball pen. You know, the tip of the pen, the ball over here. Yeah.
The ballpoint.
The ballpoint. They cannot really create that for some reason. For some strange reason, they cannot create
Really?
that. So they have to import. Yeah, they have to import this tiny point here from Germany and Taiwan and other countries to import, and then the same also with the microchip.
But
the microchip they import there.
I have to stop you from there, because what about those companies like ZTE? Those companies like not just Huawei. I'm talking about ZTE. We have companies like Realme, Oppo, Vivo.
Yeah, I understand.
What about these companies? Are you saying that they're not capable of innovating? They're Chinese companies.
Yes. They import those things from other countries, and then they assemble them in China. They made in Taiwan and the US, and then they export those to China, and then China assemble them like Legos.
Well, the fact that they're assembling it, so they probably learned from these companies how to manufacture. Huawei, in fact, in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, they made this microprocessor called Kirin processor, and
correct. But
they banned Huawei to enter the United States.
Yes, but those parts are invented in other countries. They assemble those parts. The parts again. Microchips have multiple parts. They import those parts to create those microchips.
You are correct to some extent, though, because, for instance, Huawei phones cannot use the 5G from Qualcomm because Qualcomm is a U.S. company. So essentially, Huawei cannot access those technologies because that's under license from U.S. companies. So I agree with you on that regard.
Yeah, and also the US, just recently last week, the US is now banning chips, selling chips to China. So those banning chips are those tiny components for making those Huawei chips. It's the same also with the ball pen over here. Here it was imported from Germany, something like that, from other countries, Japan also. They ship them to China, and then in China they assemble those parts to create those made in China ball pens.
Right.
The same also with the chips. Chips have very tiny parts.
Chips.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I may,
before we end, there's already 2 minutes and 5 seconds. I'd like Marco to weigh in on this, because Mabs is basically saying that China relied a lot on international U.S. technologies, European, Taiwanese technologies to make their own electronics. But do you think China cannot do it alone? Or what do you think, Marco?
Well, first of all, if you trace the history, China never had a strong semiconductor industry until the 80s, and the semiconductor industry, particularly the production of microchips, we consider that as dual technology, commercial use with military applications. So, to some extent, I would agree with Dark Adam. China has a difficulty in mastering certain level of technologies, and in terms of innovation, uh, I would agree to some extent that China is limited or cannot is not capable of innovating it on their own because of the centralized system that they in place to these companies. They tell their
or
designers,
or yeah,
engineers.
can I
Okay.
interject? Because the ballpoint thing with China was basically a logistics problem. It's not the alloys needed to create those ballpoint pens or nibs are not what's this
Not
It's not
are
available.
not
machines.
not available within China, so they have to rely on other countries
So that's
for
supply
those
chain management.
technologies. So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that the innovation is limited by what's this by
Availability
what
of
availability. It's
raw
more also with
materials.
logistics,
Okay.
which of course China is
In
also
a
doing other countries.